Somebody's doing the drumming for the Rockin' Shark. So it is 12:30, everybody. Welcome, welcome. And today we are joined by three awesome people who are going to tell us about some of the innovative assessments they've been doing in their class. So we've got Ryan, Colin, and Catherine here today. And just wanted to welcome everybody and hope you're all doing well. It's week 8, so 4.5 more weeks to go. So just hang in there. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Ryan. Is that okay?
That sounds great.
I will stop sharing this.
All right, let's make sure this is going to work. Okay. Should be redoing something here. Hold on one second.
Yeah, that looks good.
There we go. It looks good now. Yeah.
Is that all right now, or did it switch back?
It's good.
That's
good so far.
Okay. If that's too small, let me know and I'll switch it around. So welcome, everybody. We were hoping to talk a little bit about what we did in our evolution course, which we're defining as a large class that had over 400 students in it. And what we've subtitled this as emphasizing accessibility and learning in a large class. So we're going to mostly talk about examples from how we did the midterm and final exams, but there's a few other elements in here. And then we're really going to try to keep time available for as many questions as possible after this. So there's a bit of a brief overview here, and then we'll get to the questions and answer period. So we had decided on a philosophy for the course and for the assessments associated with the course. We recognized that this was a very challenging semester for students, as it is again this semester, but this was their first exposure to a predominantly or entirely remote format. So plus all the additional stress of the pandemic and other aspects happening. So we decided that we were going to try to emphasize making this course accessible, and better yet, where possible, to make use of universal design principles so that it was not so much about accommodation as just being accessible from the outset for everyone. We wanted it to be flexible in response to any challenges, so we left some capacity to adjust things like times when assignments were due or assessments were to be completed. We ended up reducing the number of activities that they were expected to do and dropped a quiz, for example, as we started to learn that students were feeling overwhelmed across their programs and within the course. And we really made a conscious effort to be understanding and compassionate and accommodating for students, and making sure they understood that we had their best interests, and that really we weren't looking to be nitpicky on due dates or things like this. We really wanted to try and make things work for them. The course historically, and again, is very concept driven. It's based on understanding concepts and clearing up misconceptions and not memorization. It's you'll see this, I think, in some of the assessment as to what we mean by that. So, we also wanted it to be engaging and enjoyable for the students and include some active learning components. We actually decided to promote collaboration among students in a couple of ways, including in a term project and on the exams, as you'll see. And the idea there was to, emphasize the fact that we're all in this together, essentially. And we also made a decision to assume positive intent by the students, that we would try to build a sense of mutual trust and respect, and hopefully head off some of the temptations for academic misconduct or inappropriate collaboration by allowing appropriate collaboration, and really emphasizing this idea that learning from each other is better than trying to find a shortcut, for example. Just a little bit about the course. As I said, it was 415 students. In terms of the instructional team, we had one faculty member, that was me, one course coordinator, Colin, at roughly 50% of his overall time allocated to the course. We had 5 regularly assigned TAs based on the enrollment, and we also applied for and received one of the extra TAs that was provided through funding from graduate studies. And this TA was not serving this sort of standard function that the other TAs were, i.e. Running seminars and doing grading. Rather, she had a particular role in developing some of the content and assessments that you're going to see, and also had completed the graduate course in teaching practice that John and Shoshana had run previously. So she had some experience with some of the software, for example, that we ended up using. Biology 2400 is a core required course for programs in IB. And in this particular offering, we had it broken down with regard to assessments into quizzes, active learning assignments, which we'll describe briefly in a bit, some discussions and reflections, which relates to the seminar activities, a midterm exam and a final exam, and a term project. So we'll describe some of these briefly, and then we'll spend most of the time talking about what we did for the midterm and the final. So a typical week for students in the course in this format would have looked something like this. They would have had 3 asynchronous lectures recorded with me presenting slides in a recorded format, and all 3 would be posted at the beginning of the week. They were available throughout the semester, so they never were taken down. There was no particular schedule on which they were supposed to view the lectures. They just had them available. They sort of went up Sunday night or first thing Monday morning, and they had access to them from then on. They also would have 1 synchronous seminar per week that was run by a TA, and they had roughly 1 quiz every other week. And as an example of what we mean by universal design, we actually gave all students double time. So normally in an online quiz in this course, I would have given students an hour. And so in this case, everyone got 2 hours. And a few cases where students registered with SAS indicated that they were looking to have time and a half. I just indicated that we actually have given everybody double time, but let us know if there's any issues. And we did not have any additional problems with students not finding they had enough time and so on. So, and we were very clear that this was intentionally done as a universal design approach. We had 1 active learning assignment every 2 weeks for the first part of the semester, and later they were working on a term project independently. And then sometimes there were additional readings or discussions in the CourseLink forum and so on. So I'm going to pass it. I'm going to let Catherine talk a little bit about the active learning assignments, because this is something that she was taking the lead on, and she can talk to you about the 2 activities we ended up using. As I said, we had initially planned to do a bit more, but we cut a few things out to make the workload a little less. And these are the 2 that the 2 major areas that we worked with.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so over the summer, I had the opportunity to learn about the Avita Ed program. So the Avita Ed program is a browser-based software. You can also download it, but it's browser-based to run population genetics kind of simulations. And a lot of the way the program is designed is to really emphasize really basic core concepts in evolution. So things like genetic drift, mutation, things like that. So we thought it would be a really neat way to sort of show some of these sort of more abstract concepts in a more hands-on fashion. So the Avita Ed development team sort of has released a laboratory manual that folks can build assignments off of. So I used that sort of as the base framework and then developed a couple of assignments off of that. So basically what the students had to do was they would go to the software program, they would run some kind of simulation, and then there were questions they had to answer in a PDF. And what we did then was that some of those questions from the activity translated immediately to an activity quiz that they completed, which was basically the 4 marks part of the assignment. But we told them to do the whole assignment because on the midterm, which we'll get to in a minute, there were additional questions based off of their understanding of those assignments. So that was the first 2 active learning assignments. And then the third one was something we call the Great Clade Race, which is based off of a paper, which is a neat way to show students how phylogeny works, basically. So you have runners that go through a race, and you sort of have checkpoints as nodes and as traits and things like that. And again, it was something where they went and did the activity, and then they had questions in CourseLink that were, again, automatically graded for the marks for that assignment. You're muted, Ryan.
Okay. Okay, so making sure that's still the right size. So the next piece was the term project, and this is based on something I had done once before in the course when it was offered on campus, and that was to have them develop a novel device, tool, activity, some way of actively teaching a concept or clarifying a misconception in evolutionary biology. In this case, they had a choice to work alone or in pairs or in groups of 3. And they had it worked out to about a month to complete this project. We had them search for available tools online to provide some context. So evolution is a topic where there's a lot of available lesson plans and other kinds of activities to try and teach core concepts. And so we had them kind of do a search for something similar to what they were thinking of doing and provide that context. They also were expected to develop their own teaching tool and then to try it out. You know, for example, run it with some friends or classmates or family members or something and comment on the effectiveness and things they might change, for example, in a revised version. And then the submission of it was an electronic version of materials from their teaching tool plus a write-up of about 12 pages. And what they had to do was introduce the topic, talk about what the learning objectives were for the tool that they were creating, summarize what is already available, describe their new tool, evaluate the effectiveness of the tool, draw some conclusions about all of this, and then there was also an author contribution statement, which is how we handled issues of collaboration. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the exams too. So this is an example of one of the projects that I pulled to show you. So students could do a number of different things. They could do a hands-on activity of some kind, develop a board game or a card game, some kind of a lesson plan, a computer simulation, interactive video series. And we saw examples of most of those things from the class. This is one that was a board game. So what the students would have submitted is a PDF version basically of the board, the cards that would go with it, instructions for the game. And basically what we told them was it should be possible for someone to print out the materials and try it if they wanted to.
Hey, Ryan.
So yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
The scale is a little bit off on the slide. Do you want to like get it out of presenter mode and try again?
How'd that go?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Looks good.
Yep. Thanks. Okay. So in any case, all the stuff I said, but also now in the proper scale. So yeah, this is one of the examples. There were a number of different card games and board games and things, and it's sort of an interesting way to think about a core concept, but also what's a creative way to engage students in thinking about it and trying to avoid misconceptions. So we saw some really pretty interesting examples come in. And this was totally fine in the remote format. Basically, we had them, as I said, provide a PDF or electronic version that could be printed and used, or it would otherwise be made clear how you would do it. And what we indicated for them was in cases where teaching tools are published, that's more or less what it is. You download the materials and then use them in your class. So that made sense. So onto the exams, which is what we'll talk about for the most part. So we decided to go with take-home formats for the exams. I should say actually what we decided to do was do a take-home format for the midterm and try it and see how it went. And there were a few reasons for this. One, it allowed us to incorporate some active learning into the evaluation process, right into the assessment, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. It was efficient in terms of grading. Most of it was multiple choice type questions that could be auto-graded in CourseLink, but fairly significantly conceptual questions, so not memorization or trivia. And again, you'll see what I mean with some examples in a moment. There were some short answer questions which were graded by the TAs, but that was all also handled within CourseLink. We allowed students to collaborate with 1 or 2 peers, but they all completed the exam individually, and they were all, you'll see one example of how we managed to ensure that they were doing this separately in one of the written questions. We provided instructional videos for relevant aspects of the exam. So for example, I had recorded a little tour of me showing them how to use some of the websites that we had them visit, and there were a few other instructional things that went along with it. So for the midterm, we had these open, it was open for around a week. We had a little bit longer for the final. They had 9 days for the final. They had unlimited access, no limit on the number of attempts. They could go back and change their answers if they wanted to. And as I said, they were allowed to work with someone. We'll talk a little bit about academic integrity topic at the end, but I can tell you they were given fairly clear instructions on what was and what wasn't acceptable with regard to that collaborative effort. So for the midterm, it was broken into 4 parts, each sort of doing a different thing. Part 1 was based on a case study in Darwin's finches. So in a normal semester, I had just basically a lecture on Darwin's finches as a case study that illustrates all of the main mechanisms of microevolution and some other concepts. So in this case, I didn't use that as one of the primary lectures that was posted. Rather, it was associated with the midterm. So they would watch this lecture about Darwin's finches. They also read a published paper. And then there were a number of questions based on this case study, which were really about applying concepts and mechanistic information about evolution to this case study in a series of questions. The second part was making use of the Avita Ed software that Catherine mentioned a minute ago. So they had already seen this, and they were pretty familiar and comfortable with it, having done 2 assignments with it. This required them to answer some questions and run a new simulation. So there was some active learning as part of the exam. In part 3, we had them visit an online population genetics simulator, run some simulations with parameters that we dictated, and then answer questions about it. And we'll give you some examples of that. Part 4, focus on tree thinking, which is interpreting phylogenies. So this was about reading evolutionary trees, using questions similar to what I would have used in a previous exam or quiz format. And then also the written question was what we've called the accurate language challenge. And I'll show you what that looked like in just a moment. Here's the kind of thing, we won't go through these in detail. I should point out, I'm happy to share the exams and materials with anybody who wants to take a closer look. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time reading through all the questions or anything. We're just going to give you a sample of kind of the type and basic nature of the questions that we used. So this is an example from the first part on Darwin's finches, the case study. And this was an example where we had them read a paper and then they would go back and interpret graphs in the paper. So you can imagine 2 students that are working together or 3 students working together. This is not really asking them a trivia question. It's not something you can just go and Google and look up. You have to basically look at the graphs and make sense of them. So we had no problem with students talking through this. And I will say that it wasn't the case that all students who worked together all gave exactly the same answers. So there was some effort to convince each other or to work through it, but they didn't always just give exactly the same answers. So this is about interpretation of some graphs in a publication, which is a skill that we're interested in having them be able to do, of course. We had some other examples of questions that would take the sort of matching format. And so in this case, it was a description of something that was observed in the case study, and they needed to connect this to the concept that it illustrated, the concept or process that it illustrated. So for example, the closer 2 populations of finches are geographically, the more similar they are genetically because of interbreeding. They need to understand, this connects with the idea of gene flow. So they have to know what the concept is, and they have to recognize it in application. There's no what is the definition of gene flow that you would memorize. It's being able to recognize the outcome of that process, for example. And these are all observations that were described in the case study. So I don't know, Catherine, did you want to talk briefly about the Avita questions?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the assignments that they were given for the active learning assignments 1 and 2 also had questions which I told them to, which we instructed them to do, but that they would not be part of the assignments themselves, they'd be part of the midterm. So this is an example of one such question where they had to understand, sort of what had happened in the simulation and what was sort of the evolutionary implications of what we'd done in the simulation. So again, this is something that they had to have a really solid understanding of both in order to answer the question. This was not a question that could be cheated on. And in a lot of cases, I know that the students were discussing it back and forth a lot to try to come to the answer. So, yeah.
Yep. So this is what I mean by sending them to a population genetics simulation website. And it's an example of one question where I gave them, so I should note, they had an introductory video that showed me using the website and where to enter the data and how to find the graph that they're supposed to look at and so on. So they could always refer back to that. I had them go through a series of these kinds of instructions in sequence. And so in this case, I had them pick on a certain setting and then run simulations with each of the following conditions. So things like the starting allele frequency, the number of generations, and the population size in different combinations, and had them run all of these and make observations about what the outcome was. Then they had to essentially interpret the significance of varying these particular parameters. So you'll see that there's different combinations that basically allow modification of one parameter while keeping the other two constant if you kind of add up all the different permutations here. So you'll have a certain allele frequency at different population sizes, for example. The generation time remain the same for them. So this would be a question based on that. So I also note I tend to be a fan of mixing up questions that ask which one is true and also which one is false. I do find that questions that are based on which one is false require a fair bit more thinking. So you're not scanning through looking for the one that's true. You have to actually assess each one on its merits. Is that it's essentially like 5 true and false questions. This is something that we do in Biology 1070 as well in the exams there. It's really about making sure they work through each option and can answer to themselves at least, or in this case to a colleague, why they would choose or not choose a particular response. So these are things that you can't, there is no way to just Google this or look it up. This is based on the results of running those simulations. And you may perhaps be willing to trust what one of your classmates came up with. But you know, that's a pretty risky proposition in terms of your overall grades. So really it was, I think, done in such a way that students would run the simulations and then talk about these options together. And as I said, they didn't always end up agreeing on which one was correct, but they had worked through it for the most part. But this isn't something you can just sort of copy, or you could, but you wouldn't know if the person was right. Because if you hadn't looked, you would really have no sense of whether they were doing it correctly or not. So this is what we mean by running something online and then interpreting in the form of the question. In another case, I provided them with graphs that were output from this software, and this would be a matching. So they were supposed to match the evolutionary mechanism with the graph that would result from that process. So, for example, genetic drift would be, say, number 1, where there's all this fluctuation in allele frequencies over time. So if you hadn't gone through what the mechanisms do to allele frequencies, if you hadn't run a bunch of practice sort of simulations to see these outputs, it would be really difficult to know what you're looking at here. So it really was intended to require that active process of going through it and then also benefiting from discussing it with students. These are not graphs I had used in any lectures. These were not from any textbook that they had. They would have had to run the simulations to get something similar to this. This is what I mean by a tree thinking question. And so this is not a tree that they had seen, but it does test a bunch of concepts that were introduced about how you read evolutionary trees, and as importantly, how not to fall for misconceptions about them. And so again, it's really about working through each of the statements and understanding kind of why. And we were quite pleased with the idea of students working through this together, you know, debating or saying, no, that's not right because that is using, you know, falling for this problem or what have you. So that was actually something that we quite liked. And then this is the written question for the midterm. So I'm not sure how well you can read this on your screen, but this is a real quote from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website. Antibiotic resistance happens when germs like bacteria and fungi develop the ability to defeat the drugs designed to kill them. That means that germs are not killed and continue to grow. Germs will always look for ways to survive and resist new drugs. More and more, germs are sharing their resistance with one another, making it harder for us to keep up. So the accurate language challenge is something that I've done in this course before, where I'll find quotes like this. When I stop cringing, I'll post them up on the discussion forum and say, okay, this is what someone is saying. what is actually happening in a process like this. So put into accurate language that talks about the evolutionary processes, allele frequencies, names the processes, and accurately talks about what's happening. So for example, germs are not looking for ways to survive and resist new drugs. There's either a mutation in the population, or it arrives from some other population, or it was, present in some frequency in the population, but irrelevant until we started treating them with antibiotics. So then you talk about the change in the proportion of individuals with that gene over many generations, and so on. And so this required them to write that out. And we found that the written questions were kind of a differentiator between students who really got it and ones who kind of got it or could recognize the correct terminology. This is a bit of a significant test of whether you really can apply the concepts. And as I said, there were almost no cases where it looked like people had borrowed heavily from each other. So I'll show you at the end how we kind of knew who worked with whom. But for the most part, even students who definitely had worked together gave their own answers on these questions. That seemed to be quite clear. So the final exam, based on the experience of the midterm, we decided to stick with this format for the final exam. Also a take-home exam. They had more than a week in this case. We also were able to, with that, we were able to set the timing of when it would be released. And so we actually looked at when other courses were likely to have their exams. The courses that students in this one were likely to be taking, when were their exams scheduled, and we tried to pick a time when it wasn't going to overlap. So we did not start it in the first week of exams, for example, and we tried to have some flexibility, tried to make sure there was, I believe we ended up with sandwiching it so there were 2 weekends there, so there would be time they could work on it. And in this case, there were 3 parts. Again, in 2 cases, they were making use of online resources. The first one is a website called Time Tree of Life, and I provided them with a video overview of me going through all the things they would be doing. And then there were 5 multiple choice questions based on the results of using that website. There was a spreadsheet they were supposed to complete to get some information that they would use in answering questions. Part 2 was about human evolution. There was, again, a video overview of a resource online, which is a website, a timeline, interactive timeline provided by the Smithsonian Institution. And then, again, 5 multiple choice questions. And part 3 borrowed these artificial cartoony organisms that were created as part of a teaching tool by SoCal in the early 80s. We didn't use them exactly the way that they are, but we used them for these kinds of comparisons that I'll show you some examples of. And there were 3 multiple choice questions and then a written question worth a fair number of marks, because it had basically 2 hypotheses you had to generate in writing, for example. So, and I've used these chem and alkyls in a few different kinds of questions in the past, in written exams, sit-down exams. This is the first time I've developed multiple choice questions about it. I think it worked just fine. So these were the 2 websites that they were meant to access. Again, there was a video that took them through how you use the 2 websites and what you click on to see this or that, and how you zoom in on things. Just so they were clear, those were available the whole time, so they could go back and re-watch if they were confused. But it was fairly straightforward. And then the questions themselves had fairly clear instructions built into them, like go to this part of the website and do this with these parameters and report on what you have. Here's an example. So you go to the Time Tree of Life website and use this particular part of the website, which is specify a group of taxa, put in mammals, and then based on what comes up, answer the question here, which is a multiple choice question. So you can see there's a number of different concepts that are incorporated into a question like this. So this would produce a phylogeny of mammals based on the species that are in that particular website's database. And it has them interpreting concepts like whether or not there's such a thing as a primitive species. It talks about the definitions of clades, sister taxa, counting the number of clades, how closely related things are, and interpreting phylogenies and so on. So you really, if you didn't run this and look at the tree, you couldn't do it. And then it's not like it just asks some trivia question about the tree. You really have to be looking at the tree. Are there 16 clades shown on the tree or not? You have to know how to identify clades and then count them up, for example. So it's a very active kind of thing. Again, students were allowed to collaborate, same as before, so they were discussing these kinds of questions and so on. There might have been, there were some questions on human evolution based on the Smithsonian website. So this was about going through and, reading different information about environmental conditions during different periods of human evolution, when certain things evolved, and some of the issues about ancestry, co-occurrent species at different times where there were multiple hominins coexisting, and so on. And so they really had to go through and assess this. This is where I use the matching function to create a multiple true-false question. So each of these statements, you're essentially matching true or false, and it allows you to create as many as you want. I usually do 5 true-false questions. Then the grades for something like this would basically be how many did you get right out of 5. So if you got 3, then you get 1/3 of the marks for that question. So these are the caminalcules that I mentioned, and as I said, they're these cartoony animals that have all these different morphological features. And in the original exercise, you're supposed to try to build a phylogeny, build an evolutionary series of relationships using these traits. I use them to kind of pick 2 or 3 and have students notice differences in traits and talk about why they might be like that. So then in an example like this, which is one of the multiple choice questions, I describe this as 2 morphs of the same species. One lives at a surface and has big eyes, and another one lives in a cave where there's no light. And then the question is, which of these options would not be a potentially valid statement about these? So they have to evaluate each of them. 4 of them would be potentially valid statements. One of them, if you know the concepts clearly, would stand out as no, that definitely isn't true. So this gets at all kinds of different issues that we discussed in the course. They hadn't seen these caminalcules before, but we had talked about blind and sighted cavefish morphs and the hypotheses about why they've lost their eyes in the cave. We also talked about, issues about genetic variation being relevant to adaptation. So if you had a population bottleneck, you might not have genetic variation. You're not going to get complex organs evolve and so on. So there's a whole bunch of concepts kind of wrapped up into this as well. And then the written question was this one. So in this case, it was 2. I picked another 2, and I said this is the male and female of a particular species. I wanted them to identify one trait that differs between them. So you can see body size. The male has markings that the female does not. It has this sort of crest on its head. It has claws and an extra toe. So they could pick any of those things. And what we said here was that, and then so what they were supposed to do was develop 2 hypotheses for why that difference might have evolved between males and females. If they were working with someone, they had to choose a different trait to discuss. They couldn't both talk about the same trait, but there were a number of options from which to choose. We indicate that what they should be talking about is 2 different processes or mechanisms that we discussed in the course. They should use accurate language. So don't just say, the male wants to get mates, so it developed claws. That's not accurate. So they had to talk about allele frequencies and the source of variation and what happens to it in a population and so on. So in a question like this, I usually won't give a question where I ask for 2 hypotheses unless I myself can think of maybe 6. And so the marking scheme that the TAs got, I think, had 6 different hypotheses in it. I didn't say they had to answer it exactly the way I did, but I said a really good answer would include some of these things. And the way we tried to assure consistency in marking for both the written question here and in the midterm was all 5 TAs marked the same 5 exams, and then they got together and talked about it, and that was basically an effort to calibrate their grading so that it would be similar enough across all of them. In a few cases, students with the final exam not having seen it had some questions about why they didn't get a higher grade. So there was a week in there or so where I was writing a fair number of emails going through their responses and saying, okay, well, here's what you said. Here's what a good, a detailed, accurate answer would have looked like. Here's why. And I think in every case they said, okay, I understand now. So One thing to bear in mind, I suppose, is with a final exam, you're not really giving them direct feedback because they have to ask to see the exam. And we had a little bit of fun. Catherine likes to remind me I probably spent way too much time on this, but there were a number in one of the questions for the time tree. There were a number of pairwise comparisons they were supposed to do. So they were supposed to put in these two species and find out when they last shared a common ancestor. And then there were a bunch of questions about that. So I just decided, well, let's have a little bit of fun with the pairings that we have. So some students definitely started noticing what these pairings were. And I think that kind of just made it a little bit less stressful, again, that there was a little bit of playfulness involved with this kind of question. So that we had a little bit of fun with it. So again, the idea here was to promote what is sometimes called ethical collaboration, but really we kind of tried to think a bit about why students cheat. And often I think that's to do with things like a strong emphasis on grades rather than understanding. If the expectations or instructions are not clear, if the assessments are very high stakes, if there's a lot of stress involved with the assessment process, if there's not enough time to complete their work, if the assessments are based on trivia where it's easy to cheat, if they have no sense of ownership in their own learning process, or if there's just a lack of a culture of integrity and mutual respect and trust. I think we built up a pretty good rapport with the students over the semester, having been very flexible, very open in our communication, explaining what we were doing, being very receptive to their concerns. I think that created a strong sense that we were kind of in this together, and that had them feeling that they should hold up their end of it. And in total, with 415 students across all the assessments, I believe we submitted 3 cases of academic misconduct in the course. So this is how we kind of managed some of that. So there were instructions associated with the midterm and the exam. You'll see here you're allowed or encouraged to work collaboratively. Here's some examples of acceptable collaborations, talking about the material, working through the questions, all that sort of thing. Here's some unacceptable collaborations, just basically getting other people's work and taking it as if it were your own. And we were very clear that they had to provide, they had to indicate that they had read and understood this, so we took that as an indication that they agreed to these stipulations. And then at the end of the exams, there would be a text response required as part of the quiz format in CourseLink to talk about, basically this is an acknowledgement and author contribution statement like you'd see in many journal publications now. Who did you work with? What did you each contribute? And we were very clear that if you're not honest and complete about this information, that we will count that as academic misconduct. So in a couple of cases that we saw, I think there was a student where it was very clear they had worked together and they didn't list it, and there was another, I think, where the others were, I think they borrowed too much text from an online source, basically. But mostly they did complete this, and we could go and check. And as I said, their answers for the written questions were definitely different. So they had probably talked about it, but they didn't write them together. We had lots of student feedback. We had incorporated a question at the end of the exam, just what was sort of the most challenging thing about the course, what was the most surprising thing you learned, stuff like that, plus the course evaluations. And there was a lot of feedback that the format in particular of the exams was very low stress relative to doing this, in a sit down, time constrained kind of mechanism. It also allowed them to work around other aspects of their schedule. And being able to collaborate with someone really helped them to work through. And many of them commented that they actually learned something in doing the exam rather than just having their knowledge assessed as part of it. So some lessons learned. It does take work to create concept-based questions that can be graded automatically. We've been doing it in 1070 for quite a long time now, and I think we've gotten pretty good at it. So I'm fairly comfortable doing it. It does take some work up front. But it can be fun, like you saw with the interesting species pairs. Overall, it took us less time in grading than we'd actually expected when we took this format, and that allowed our TAs to do more things with in terms of interacting directly with students and creating a bit of a sense of community. We did find that students, at least initially, were quite wary when we talked about being flexible and don't worry, we're going to adjust this, and they're sort of like, well, we've heard that before. But in the end, I think they were very appreciative. There's a few, of course, that really want a rigid schedule, but most, I think, felt very appreciative that we were willing to kind of move, how long, like when would the final exam start? Well, we've based that on your other schedule. I think they found that good. There are some technical hiccups. We can answer those. We do recommend testing activities pretty thoroughly beforehand, if possible. You can build a sense of trust and community, even in a remote format. There were a lot of student comments about how the weekly interactions with the TAs and the open discussions that they had was a really big part of that. But I think even the way the lectures were delivered was commented on. There was humor in there, and there was lots of discussion on the discussion forums. I did not have a major concern that academic integrity was going to be a major challenge here, because again, we had them, they had a sense of ownership in this, and I'm like, well, if it's open book or they can Google stuff, there's nothing they can look up that's going to give them the answer to that question, right? They need to go through it. They can't just find that somewhere. The take-home exam was much less stressful for the students, and in my opinion, provides a better test of their actual understanding versus all the other variables that get brought in sort of accidentally when you have a sit-down written exam. So, for example, how fast can they read a question and write the answer? How do they respond under stress? How good is their memory? Those kinds of things. I don't want to test those things. I want to test their ability to use and understand concepts. And I feel like this did a bit better job of that. So the truth is, I probably won't go back to sit-down written exams, even when we're back on campus. I think I will stick with this format. And also, it did not require us to use any of the proctoring software that we know has inherent biases that are quite problematic in our view. So that's the end of the kind of overview there. I will stop that sharing, and then we're happy to answer questions. I guess we've got a bit of time left, so that's great. And anything you want to have us answer or try to talk about.
Wow, thank you very much, Ryan, Catherine, Colin, wonderful. Folks, if you've got a question, you can use the raise hand function. It's usually at the top, and just push the button there. Chris Meyer has a question. Chris, go ahead, open your mic and your video.
Yeah, thanks everyone on the call here. That was great. I was like frantically typing out ideas for questions, so that's I got a lot of like great ideas from this talk. Thanks very much. Question I have is for your exams. Are you using CourseLink or some other platform?
It was all in CourseLink, and we basically just used the quiz function. So each part of the exam would be a quiz. And so they would see them all, and it would say part one, and it, for their experience, was the same as doing a quiz. So they would click in, and it was a series of questions. We did allow them to go back and forth with questions, unlimited access and number of attempts and all that sort of stuff. But and there were cases where, it was like, okay, so go to this website and run this activity, then answer this question. But it was all we just did it entirely as a quiz in CourseLink. Char has a question about Colin's role. Colin, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, it was just actually just to add one more thing about the quiz format. Quizzes are a little more challenging in CourseLink than some other formats, and we did have lots of technical challenges as we went, and most of these we were able to work out. One really interesting one you don't think of is when you have a written question in a quiz in CourseLink, you can't see if the TAs have marked it or not, like you can in Dropbox when they save as a draft. And so how do you know if it's been marked? You can kind of sort by mark later on, but there were some unexpected technical challenges that I think we managed to accomplish as we went. In terms of my role, of just logistics, so student email, working with the marks, working with the TAs, and that kind of thing, and just trying to keep up with being flexible for the students means that it's a little bit harder on our end. So I think that's something else, a really important point to make. You kind of have to look at how many hours you have and what you can do. And I think we were pretty fortunate because we did have quite a bit of support for the course. But even something like for our final project, we allowed them to work individually, groups of 2 or groups of 3. And that kind of came up at the last minute. It was really hard to set that up in CourseLink. And so I think if we had and going through it the first time, you've got to try things, right? The second time going through, I think if we know that, then I can think of some ways that we can set that up logistically to make it really smooth. So often it was trying to figure out how to deal with things after they'd happened. But I think we got it all worked out in the end. So.
Well, so to maybe counter some of the modesty there, Colin, I think to me, it felt very much like a team effort. Colin was the go-to person for the TAs and overseeing the seminars, the grading, was the person that many of the students interacted with when they had an issue about, like we had various people whose somebody in their family got sick or they themselves were, can we have an extension? And one of the things we really liked about this format was it was super easy to accommodate that. So there was no makeup midterm. There was no reweighting to the final. It was just, okay, we'll open it for you for the next week then. In fact, there were a couple places where Colin was, we were able to say to the students, like, well, tell us when you're feeling better and we'll open it for 7 days. They were allowed to collaborate before. Maybe they could, ask somebody for the answers, but that didn't seem to be the case. So Colin was very much like someone that the students were aware of and became very comfortable with. The TAs absolutely were, interacting regularly with Colin. So I think it was, we kind of divided it up a little bit, and maybe not unlike the way you would do in many courses where the lecture is sort of, faculty's running that, but then the lab component, for example, in this case, it was the seminar discussions. And then Catherine was one of the extra TAs that we got from graduate studies, and we specifically said, what her role is going to be is to help, use some of these activities that she's become familiar with and develop some of these assignments and questions for the exam. And then I did some of the other stuff like the time tree and the population genetic simulator and things, and wrote those questions. So it was, I think a good division of labor, but Colin was very much a face that the students knew.
I had a question, and then I think
John
Vincent has one. Take my hand down. So I wanted to ask about the collaboration. I probably don't have time to analyze this yet, but was there a performance advantage to working together with other people?
I think it would be really hard to say based just on this, because there were so many other variables. One, we were just, we were experimenting, and we told them we're experimenting too. We haven't done this before either. The other is we were also very conscious of not overloading them with stuff, not being, too stringent on certain things. So, if we didn't want to make it so that it was impossible to do well, we were sort of wanting there to be a high success rate. I think overall the grades were very, I guess I would say the grades weren't exceptionally higher than you might normally see. I think they're maybe a little bit higher, but given that this was a pandemic situation, and I'm pretty comfortable that those assessments were not, just simple breeze to get through. You had to do the work. Overall, I think it worked out. It wasn't. There certainly was no disadvantage to that approach. My intuition is there was definitely an advantage. There were a lot of comments about students who said, that doing those midterms, the midterm and the exam actually helped them to understand the concepts better, because they were applying it. They were actually going and doing something and applying it, rather than just regurgitating sort of stuff they had seen passively. So I think there's advantage potentially in grade. I think there's almost certainly an advantage in longer term retention or understanding. There was an advantage in lower stress. Grades might not be the best metric just because of all the other things going on, but I think you could certainly do that comparison. So Colin has asked, was it an exam or an assignment? And so that discussion has come up because we're working on currently designing a competency-based education model of this course for DE with Open Ed. And that's basically blowing it up completely and saying, all the standard formats aren't relevant anymore. All the things that are designed because it's built around a 12-week semester and a weekly this and that are not relevant. So the question that came up about if we're going to do exams like this, or not even do exams, spread this out. So one thing you could do is not have a midterm and a final, but rather have those parts appear at various points in the semester. That would work perfectly fine too. Is there a difference between an exam and an assignment? The only difference I can really see is that if it's a final exam, it can spill over into the exam period. So you get a little bit of extra time for them to complete it once classes end. Other than that, it's really not. I mean, they've got time, they can work together, they can look stuff up, they can go and run activities. It's not fundamentally different from a project or assignment. And that doesn't matter as far as I can see. It's still assessing it in a useful way. But I think with the CBE model that we're doing, it will be broken up throughout the semester. There won't be a midterm or a final.
Thanks a lot. I think Jason.
Jason, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. It's fantastic, really exciting. I was just going to mention quick, I really liked the activity where they did a game or something like this to describe a misconception. And I've seen similar, and it's fantastic. And I've seen sometimes where students struggle, though, to get like a topic for that. So I was wondering if they came up with their own misconceptions, or if you had lists for them or things like that.
They had a list. So we gave them a list of a non-exhaustive list, but said, you might choose from this, or you might come up with your own. We also encouraged them to talk to their TA beforehand. Like, so this is roughly what we're thinking. Is this appropriate? And so they did have an opportunity for comments and feedback before they put in all the effort.
Right.
But we did have a list. We said, here's all the sort of main mechanisms. Here's some things that we know, students have these issues with understanding selection or understanding phylogenies or whatever. You might want to choose one of these. And we also listed ideas for the kind of stuff they may wish to do. So, we said board game, card game. There's a ton of examples of people using gummy bears or jelly beans or Legos or dice or whatever to illustrate concepts. And so I said, you can just search around, you'll find a ton of examples. So I don't know, Colin, do you have a sense that anybody sort of struggled to find one? I think the TAs were also very good in giving the feedback. The TAs were bought into this too, by the way. That's a huge piece. They were very engaged and very interested. So that was a big part of generating that sense of engagement.
Yeah, it seemed like the students had a great time with it. We probably had a third work in pairs, a third in individually, and a third in threes. And they had lots of really interesting concepts. And one thing I liked about the assignment too is that they had to talk about the other examples that they found in the literature and why theirs was novel. And that's kind of a good thing, because you're kind of building off of what's happening. And so that's applicable in different ways of thinking as well. So I don't think they had trouble finding concepts or topics to write about or ideas. And if they did, could talk to their TA. So it worked out really well.
Yeah, that's great.
So I should maybe say too, so I've just mentioned that the TAs played a really important role, and they were given a lot. They were basically independent members of the teaching team in their particular role. So they had free reign over what they did in their seminars, basically. They were meeting weekly to kind of discuss things and talk about experiences and ideas and stuff. But they really were able to kind of do their seminars how they wanted. And so sometimes they would go through, concepts, or they would talk about a particular topic or invite questions from the students. And I think that really, and they were just really, really engaged themselves and interested. And because they had, freedom and a sense of ownership too, they took that on, and I think really put in the effort and the intellectual contribution to make it their own, and that I think made a big difference for how the students felt about it. So about the sense of community and engagement with that. And again, that also builds up some of that sense of trust. Like, you don't want to disappoint your TA or others if you've got a relationship with them, right? So I think that was really important. So it does matter that you have good TAs, but you can also give them quite a bit of freedom and trust that they're going to do great things with it. I was just very thrilled. I mean, I think I wrote to them a bunch of times with, especially near the end. I was like, just, thank you so much, because this was like, I really enjoyed the course actually, overall, and notwithstanding all the other issues with the pandemic and all those challenges. But I really felt the course went well, and TAs, Colin, Catherine, were a huge part of all that.
Wow. Are there any other questions from the gang out there? We're here for another couple of minutes, maybe one more question, cognizant of everyone's time.
While everyone there is thinking of a question, I'll just mention we're going to follow up with a very quick email following this event. We're calling it Continue the Conversation. So if you heard something here that you would like to implement in your practice, and maybe you're not quite sure how, or maybe you can have some help from peers, not the three of you per se, I'm not going to put this on you, but from COESP, from your peers, if there's anything that could help you out, we want to kind of collect that, and again, kind of continue that conversation, so that this doesn't end here at 1:30. We have a chance to continue this for your own practice as well.
Yep, and I'm happy to download or however else you can export the stuff from CourseLink and share that with anybody who wants to see it. There's no proprietary, examples of questions. I'm not that concerned about them getting out or anything either. Yeah. So any other thoughts? I mean, I guess one of the issues that we did worry, well, not worry, I guess that we were aware of potential concerns about academic integrity with doing a take-home exam. And so people would ask, isn't that open book? And and the answer just kind of constantly was, but there's nothing to look up that would give you the answer to this. So it's really, I think, contingent on the kind of assessment you're doing. So if you're asking them to apply a concept or go do something, have all the books you want. There's none of that stuff in the book. And in fact, if you can find a source that helps you to understand, interpreting those graphs or something, great, like good, that you just did some active learning, right? So I guess that's how I feel. The other was that we tried to indicate to them that when you're doing real science, you don't walk around with a huge amount of just stuff memorized, right? Like that's the reason we have, like I'm looking behind John's, there's books and notebooks and things, and it doesn't have all that stuff memorized, right? You can look it up. And one of the skills is knowing where to look it up, how to interpret things. But the other is we work collaboratively. I mean, that's all the time. And what we said to them is, this little statement you're making at the end, this author statement, is something that we have to do for a lot of journals now, right? To say, this is what I contributed, this is what my co-author contributed, and so we're not asking you to do anything that isn't part of modern scientific activity. And you should be talking about this stuff, right? I mean, that is how you're going to learn it better. So again, that idea too, where we were encouraging them to communicate with each other, even though we're all at a distance right now, I think further added to the notion that it's still a collective, it's still a group, rather than a bunch of people stuck in their bedrooms kind of thing. So it just all kind of adds to that overall. It's intangible a bit, but there's sort of generating that sense that this is something that you might as well invest in, that we do want you to do well. There is opportunities. We're not trying to make it, there's no trick questions. We're not going to pull a fast one on deadlines. You will know ahead of time exactly what it is. The instructions will be clear. And we want you to work together and work through these concepts as a group. So, once you kind of get rid of the worry that everybody's looking to cheat, I don't know. I didn't feel stressed about it. I don't know. I can't speak for Colin or Catherine, but I wasn't stressed about academic misconduct, to be honest.
Well, some of the comments we got as well afterwards, with the students saying that they felt like they learned things and that they were actually applying things. Like, I think that goes along with the trust piece, is that, like, we trust you that you all are scientists in training. We trust that you all, want to learn these things such that you want to learn them. And, and that paid off really well, because a lot of the students, put in a ton of effort. Like, one of the reflection questions on the final exam was, what did you find most interesting about this course? And they got a mark if they put basically anything. But a lot of students wrote paragraphs.
Wow.
Like, they wrote a ton. They were like, I didn't know this about human evolution. That's super interesting. And I'm going to go take an anthropology class now because I'm super, like, a ton of students did something like that. So it was obviously meaningful to a lot of them.
Well, I'll just close on one comment, which is, when we think about learning objectives, I think about what do I consider, a successful course in terms of, are the students more educated rather than just older when they finish it? And by educated in that field, what I mean is, like, the example I give is, let's say you're walking with a friend or your family in the woods and you see this really weird bird. It's got this crazy looking thing on its head. And somebody says, you took biology. What's the deal with that bird? And you say, I don't know. I've never seen that bird. Here's the 4 possible explanations for why it has that.
Yeah.
To me, that means you get it. If you can do that, if you can apply it to a new context and know the basic kind of underlying principles and concepts, you now get it. And that's what we try to assess. If that's what I want them to do, That's what we should assess. So here's a graph you've never seen, but if you understand the process, you can interpret it. That's what we try to assess. So that actually, I think, is easier to do in a take-home format like this, an active format like this, than a sit-down written exam.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. It's a wonderful topic, lots to think about. So just thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Catherine. And everyone, take a look at your email. You'll get that email about continuing the conversation. And with that, I'm just going to say, see y'all later. Have a great afternoon. Maybe get outside. Great. It's beautiful. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jason.
No worries.
Bye.
Bye.
I am